All right, so this is video 2 for the week 4 summary series. Week 1, the video 1 of the summary series was just a brief discussion looking at your comments about Chapter 5, The Preacher, from Ryrie's The Sorcerer's Tale. In this video, we're going to look at how the chapter demonstrates argument of fact. So I'm going to walk through, I think I mentioned this in the first video, I don't know, should remember that we're going to walk through arguments of fact and then arguments of definition and causal arguments in this chapter. And then we're going to make the final video, which will be video 6 of this, so 6, and we'll talk about the conceptual and thematic connections that I would like you to see in this. So it's kind of extensive analysis. This is sort of what's been taking me so long to put this together. And also, like I said before, in the week 8 video, I had a technical interruption while I was doing this. I just can't believe I figured out that because of some settings that I changed, my computer was saving files incorrectly. I was getting the audio, but I wasn't getting the video, which I guess would be slightly interesting if you wanted to. It could be sort of just podcast style, which would be too bad. Then you're not looking at me. Although Daniel said he doesn't look at me, which I understand because he wants to stare at me the whole time if you don't have to. And I imagine when you're in class, you're not looking at me the whole time either. You're just listening to me drone on and on. So we're going to look at different aspects of Chapter 5 really quick and how they demonstrate arguments of fact. I am going to try to pause between sections so that it's not awkward while I scroll to each section. Hopefully it doesn't result in strange jump cuts, which I hate, and which is why I don't do the editing for these videos, because I know my style, or my ability, I should say, would not allow me to, how do I say, overcome jump cuts, weird jump cuts, and I really have a dislike for jump cuts. I don't, yeah, I'm totally against. I'm the whole I don't know, the Scorsesean full let the camera run, awkward Artur perspective. So here we go. Let's get into it so that it's less actually awkward. And so I'm going to share my screen really quick so we can look at this. So we're going to take a look at the text itself. And I have this, I should have had it set up differently. We're going to look at the Lunsford et al. Text. Everything's an argument here. And we're looking at Chapter 8. And Chapter 8, if you don't remember, was assigned during the same week of week 4 of the Chapter 5 preacher text, of the preacher text. I was hoping the application was pretty apparent. I don't think that it necessarily was. I didn't notice anybody make any connections, or certainly I didn't ask for explicit comments on it. And so we're going to go over it right now so you can kind of see how it sticks out. It appears in almost, I should say, as mentioned in your Everything's an Argument text, it's a very common aspect of historical analysis. If we scroll up really quick, I don't want it to be too awkward. If you scroll up really quick, this paragraph itself talks about, factual arguments routinely address broad questions about how we understand the past. That's exactly what Ryrie's doing. And so it looks at, he says, the telling of history is almost always controversial and rarely stated. So in Everything's an Argument, very clearly pointing out where Ryrie is coming from. And so, and in a sentence, or do the facts that we teach today sometimes reflect the perspectives and prejudices of earlier times or ideologies, or as we'll see, Ryrie points out, they're not necessarily coming from reflections of perspectives and prejudices of earlier times and ideologies. They're actually coming from our current perspectives and prejudices being placed on those time periods. So it's awkward, we're not adopting the historical perspective per se. I mean, I guess you could say, but more heaping our own understanding of what it should have been or what we should believe it to be, instead of recognizing it, in Ryrie's point, as what is. And then I think this section or this paragraph here in the chapter really speaks to what we're looking for when we consider arguments of fact. And so that the idea that arguments of fact report on what has been recently discovered and explore the implications of that new information. So something's new, and we're sort of, so well, what does this mean to us, right? So how can we use it? And the idea they add interest and complexity to our lives, taking might seem simple and adding new dimensions to it. And that's, I want you to take that. So something that seems simple, oh, we should understand it this way. It makes very clear, but actually it's way more complex than that. We should dive further into that. And that's essentially what this class is about, and what a lot of academic pursuits are, is that pointing out, well, yeah, we could understand it that way and it works. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's how we should understand it, and that's not the only way that it works. And if we understand all of the aspects of whatever it is that we're studying, we could use it or we could use this information in ways that we didn't understand before. And it links back to what Okafor was saying about how futurism and that, or her understanding of what science fiction is political writing, and that the what if and the possibility source. And I harp on this, like I feel like I say this every video, because I think it's so significant that she's pointing out that when she's writing about possible worlds, that she's not writing about them as something that she fantasizes about per se. It's something that she would like to come to be, right? So I guess you could say, well, yeah, that is fantasizing, but it's more like advocating. It's like saying, well, I'm making the choices in my narrative because that's the world I would like to see, right? It's not saying, well, I wish it could be this way. It's saying, I want it to be this way, and I'm going to write about it as it being this way, so that every time I write about it, I put into the world what I want to see in the world. And so when somebody reads what I say, they're imagining the possibility of that same world, whether or not they think it's actually more or less probable. It's putting that perspective into play. It's allowing for a political perspective to demonstrate in sort of like choices that can, I mean, that's what politics is. It's the distribution of power amongst a myriad of choices. That's a reductive definition of politics, but basically what Okafor is saying, her ability to create the stories that she does is a political act, because she is empowering a vision of possibility. And that's, you could say that's what the authors are stating here, is this idea. If we go next to the next sentence, in many situations, they're precursors to other forms of analysis, right? Especially causal and proposal arguments. And those are significant, especially getting into proposal arguments, which we're not going to get into in this class. And it may be that, and no, that doesn't mean anything to you, but that at this point in the curriculum, that the USem doesn't really create a project or that is applicable to your community. And that's something that I think is a downfall of the program, is that it should be much more action oriented. And we're hoping that that's true. And if you think that that's important to you, I encourage you to make your voice known on campus or whenever you can, as much as possible, that your classes, your professors, and the school focuses on the actual action that could be put into play with the development of your own perspectives, because there's so many and you're working so hard, and you have there's a lot of creative energy that could be transformative on campus. And that's essentially what they're saying here, is that when we unearth arguments of fact and we play them out, what we're doing is we're developing these precursors. We're developing this view, this what if in Okafor's language, of how we could create a causal link, and propose from that causal link ways in which these issues could be approached, solved, and or circumvented, whatever it might be. So the arguments of fact here are essentially like, you could say like, I don't want to say scissors. That seems like they're I know there's a better word than this, but they're like, somebody might call them like emergent in some way, that they are certain novel perspectives, and these novel perspectives or these novel um, connections or whatever they are, and I know novels I think become sort of had a negative connotation with the novel coronavirus, but again, like the fact that it is itself novel has developed a myriad of um, arguments of fact about how we connect with each other, about our economics, about our supply chains, the distribution of and the lack of, I should say, the general inequality of access to like the internet, to education, to food, to healthcare. It this this the fact that it's novel is what's significant about it. I mean, you could say that the situation we're in is a really, it's like a, I don't know, like, I don't want to say like maybe a harbinger or of arguments of fact. Like every day, new arguments of fact are coming out about how we approach the situation that we're in, because people are constantly forced to question the situation as we knew it, right? And that's pretty much what an argument of fact is. And I think you've understood that from what I saw earlier in the discussions. And then this last sentence takes us there. Before we can explore why things happen as they do or solve problems, we need to do our best to determine the facts, like what it is that we're working with. And so we're looking at, well, do we actually understand what it is that we're talking about, or have we just assumed that we do? And that goes into the next section here. It's silly cartoon, but in the next section, when it describes characterizing factual arguments, one of it, it goes to the fact that when we make observations about, what do we believe or not, or what's missing, we quickly lead to hypotheses, and it's the hypothesis is what it's taking the questioning to where we're going, and that's exactly what you're doing in your fuse. Now, if we look at, and I'm not going to spend the whole time just talking about the arguments of fact, I just want to jump into how this plays into chapter 5. If we go to chapter 5, you look, just this is at the very beginning of the preacher, he's introducing the situation here, and he has 3 different sort of variations of argument of fact. The last 2 are interconnected, but I was just highlighting the difference by the language, the sort of the discourse marker, indicating that there is a argument of fact. But the first thing to notice that he's moving into an argument of fact at the beginning here is he says it's a neat word. And so you have that sense of understatement. Understatement is used a lot when prompting arguments of fact. So he's saying, oh, well, it's neat, right? Meaning that it ties everything up nicely. And so it looks nice, it looks clean. It's sort of like, that idea that you would hide things under the rug, sort of, sweep it away. Or, what's that? There's a terrible other cliche, like, if it's not seen, then it's not harm, nothing, so that, or that like, see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil type, like, if you keep it out, it doesn't exist, which is great from a religious, he's a religious scholar, religious perspective, and that's, I think, a lot of what he's trying to complicate here is that religiously, that the Reformation has been sort of misunderstood, and I think it's because it became appropriated and this is from his perspective, generally like appropriated by a non-religious, I guess you could say laity, who took the Reformation to create a economic transformation, economic revolution, and used the Reformation as a cultural touchstone from which to embed a righteousness into, um, um, you know, piracy, joint venture stock companies, and just and like exploitation, worldwide exploitation. So, and I know I don't mean to be the guy who's constantly sounding like, capitalism is horrible and you should question our capitalist worldview. All I'm saying is that, you're a freshman in college, and it's a great time to think about the world that you live in and how it got to be the way it is. And this is just one way of thinking about it. And you're also faced with one, currently global uh, a pandemic, I guess that's kind of redundant, but a pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in over 100 years. On top of that, though, where does that come from? Why is that happening? Is is it really just the fact that the Chinese government, or that people in Wuhan were have cultural practices and a lack of oversight that allowed this disease to flourish, or was there something else? And does that something else have anything to do with the fact that people are being pushed into, or new markets are developing at such a rapid rate that people are being pushed into areas in the world that haven't been used in ways that create capital and profit and all that stuff? And is that the reason that we're seeing sort of these issues? And on top of that, I think that the general crisis that you all have grown up facing, and I know I have, so of course you have, is the idea that and whether or not you believe it to be true, that that we have to do something about our climate, and at some point and some people say it's already happened, but that we have to make real sacrifices, how we act in this world, or sacrifice and make changes about how we act in this world, so that we do not cause any more harm, and that we can live in it in a way that won't be so destructive. So in that regard, if you are looking at what Ryrie's talking about, he's re-envisioning the Reformation, saying, this is a neat way to describe it, for a set of events which were by turns exhilarating, appalling, frightening, above all confusing for those who lived through them, right? So it's usually remembered as a point at which England abandoned. So it's usually remembered. So again, another signal that he's talking about a argument of fact. And again, a transition which is often seen, another discourse marker about, he's talking about an argument of fact, and it did not seem quite like that for those who lived through it. So he's saying, well, this is completely different if you think about those people who actually were there, and not if we look at it from our perspective. So that's the first indicator that he's using an argument of fact. The second one, if we look at, it's like a brown color, it's horrible. But if you look at this second highlight, you again have this marker, wisdom's exploits might at first sight seem. So again, argument of fact, if we look at them one way, first reading, cursory reading, we see them this way, that they have little to do with religion. But if we look at them through a different lens, then we're going to see them a different way. And so again, it's another argument of fact. And this idea, he'll introduce to a side of the Reformation. So, oh, wow, there are multiple sides. So that's another way of which argument of fact. And then finally, in this last, I should say, in this one, it says upheavals of the 16th century in a new light. So again, another discourse marker, a new light. It's a great phrase. So all these I'm indicating are just little discourse markers that you could use in your own writing to highlight arguments of fact. And then finally, that when he transitions to the next paragraph and gets more into the body, that is to tell this side of the story. So again, we have this side of the story. We're looking at something different. So he says, and he brings us that way. So we have provide more context to us side, and then gets to the next sentence here in a new light, and then to tell this side of the story. So it's constantly putting that together in ways so we can see how that's packaged to understand that it's an argument of fact.